This year, a series of record-breaking extreme weather events have caused untold damage across the world.
Trees, concrete, bricks, the force of that being swept down the river is what took these houses to pieces.
We're talking about 500,000 acres of land that is or has been burnt.
As global temperatures continue to rise, these events will only become more frequent and more intense. So far, global efforts to reduce carbon emissions have been insufficient. Negotiations at COP26, the UN's next climate summit in November, could be critical in determining the future of the planet. Ahead of COP26, subscribers joined Economist journalists to discuss why climate change is such a difficult problem and what world leaders must do to address it.
My name is Sasha Nauta. I'm the Deputy Executive Editor of the paper. And today we're going to talk about climate change and what we can expect from COP26, the UN's upcoming climate summit that will take place in Glasgow in November. And with me to discuss this, I'm delighted, two of my favourite colleagues, Oliver Morton, the Economist Senior Editor for Essays and for Briefings. Hello, Oliver.
Hi, Sasha.
And Katrine Brake, our Environment Editor. Hi, Katrine.
Hi, Sasha.
Let's get straight to it. Katrine, I'm going to start with you. You've written about this, and all of us will have seen it's been a year of sort of record-breaking extreme weather events, serious floods in China, in Western Europe, heat waves and droughts in North America, and even wildfires in the subarctic. How sure are scientists that all these events that we've seen are indeed caused by our own actions?
They're really quite sure. I mean, obviously, it depends on the event that you're talking about. But just to speak about the general term, the sort of general trend, which is climate change. So recently, hopefully, our readers will have seen that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out with its next big report on the physics of climate change. And their sort of top phrase there was that it was unequivocal, that's the term they used, that human greenhouse gas emissions are causing the rise in global average temperatures. So just as in terms of the sort of big picture, right, climate change, that is unequivocally linked to human greenhouse gas emissions. If I'm perfectly honest, they've known that before, and the scientists are really just trying to come up with bigger and bigger terms. I don't think if you spoke to, I don't think there are many climate scientists who would say that their conviction on that has really changed much in recent years. But then going to specific weather events, it's interesting as somebody who has covered climate change for many years to have seen this sort of transition. I remember maybe 10 years ago, people would start to ask, this specific event, or for instance, Hurricane Katrina, it was a big standout one, but floods, droughts, heat waves, to what extent can we say that was caused by climate change? And this is a field of science known as attribution. At the time, there was a bit of a mantra adopted by both the scientists and the journalists who interviewed them, which was that although science could attribute the general trend towards more and more extreme weather events, they couldn't attribute any individual event, any specific event to climate change. And that has very much changed with the growth, the development of this field called attribution. And the idea here is to really break down the sort of conditions that trigger a specific event and look using computer models at whether or not those conditions, those patterns and the geophysical conditions that create that weather event can be linked to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. I won't go into the details, but they basically run sort of two parallel worlds, one in which there are greenhouse gas emissions and one in which there aren't. And to cut to the chase, increasingly we are seeing events that can be more and more linked to climate change. So you mentioned the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest. That was a real sort of breakthrough event in terms of attribution. The finding there was that basically the event couldn't have happened in a world that didn't have climate change, that didn't have greenhouse gas emissions as generated, as produced by humanity over the last 120, 150 odd years. The fires in the Arctic, you also mentioned, those have also, again, now I'm looking at the ones that were, because these have been going for several years now, but I think it was the 2019 ones where they ran an attribution study. And again, there it was found that those fires would not have happened in the absence of human climate change. That's not to say that every single event is basically impossible without climate change. Some of these events are merely made more likely as a result of climate change. Sorry, that was a bit long,
So we
but
can't.
I could
No,
go
no,
on
no,
about this
no,
at
no.
length.
I know you could. I know you could. But basically, we're not just a bit unlucky. We're not just living through a slightly unlucky time. We definitely have.
We're definitely not. No.
We're responsible. Oliver, you've looked at the issue of climate change for a very long time, and I believe and have been responsible for a lot of our coverage of it. Am I right in thinking that we first put it on our cover in 2010? I think we might have a picture of that actually. Was it before that? Go on.
We may have a picture of that, but I'm pretty sure that I wrote our first climate change cover in 1989.
There you go. Okay, well, you're underlining my point actually.
I haven't been here all the time. I haven't been here all the time since. It was a very pretty cover of a sundial with a bird on it, and half the sundial was in summer and half was in winter. It was very lovely. Can't remember what the leader said. Except I guess it probably said the things that people knew in 1989, which is that the greenhouse gases warm the atmosphere, and the increase in greenhouse gases, driven up mainly by carbon dioxide, but not only, will warm the atmosphere further. And basically what people said in 1988, 1989, which was when people were first really saying that the evidence was beginning to point in the direction that, as Kat said, is now seen as unequivocal. That was when we first put it on the cover. That was when Jim Hansen talked about it in Senate hearings, I think for Al Gore in 1988. Now our 2010 cover, if I remember it correctly, was about the fact that however much mitigation you do, however much you reduce emissions, there is still going to be warming to which the world is going to have to adapt. And that's always been a slightly problematic, certainly early on then, that was still a slightly problematic thing to say. People like Mr. Gore would occasionally say that talking about adaptation was basically talking about surrender, which is a dangerous road to go down, because the people who are affected most by climate change are often, almost always, not the people who have been responsible for the largest amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And also, it just suggests putting everything onto mitigation and then not doing that mitigation has a tendency to just leave people feeling very unempowered. And the strange thing about climate change, the really fundamentally unlike anything elseness of climate change, is that humanity and individuals feel at the same time extremely powerful and utterly impotent in its face. When you look at it, people like us are, through the things that we do in an everyday way, changing the very basic nature of the geophysics of the planet. So that's an immense amount of power. At the same time, to do that in a coherent way means aligning the interests or aligning the activities of a big fraction of 7.5 going on 8 billion people. And that sounds almost impossible. So you have this situation where one is simultaneously astounded by the power of humanity and feeling absolutely powerless to do anything about it. And, this is summed up in this idea that we now have of the Anthropocene, of an era in which humans are like a force of nature in the world, a defining force of nature. And the thing about forces of nature, the thing we understand about forces of nature, is that they are beyond our control. So we are simultaneously a force of nature and thus beyond our own control. And that's the fundamental emotional crux for me of why climate change is both the most fascinating and one of the most difficult issues to come to grips with in the modern world.
And so, Ollie, given that, I want to bring in a question from one of our readers, Susan, who says, humans have known about this, to this point of disconnection. have known the seriousness of climate change for more than a decade, and some for far longer than that, and yet have not really changed their habits. What will it take to bring everyone together? I mean, you know, Kat talked earlier about wildfires and droughts and all sorts of things. Given everything you just said, what kind of scenario, or I mean, do we just have to think in disasters, or is it a very different type of thing that it would take to actually bring people together to address this issue?
Well, I think you can see something there. You've got a lesson there from the Paris Climate Conference that happened in 2015 that gave us the Paris Agreement. And the way that that worked was partly because of a lot of clever diplomacy, notably by the French, and partly because of a lot of stage management that really brought home to people at that meeting that renewable energy was a big part of the coming future for energy generation. And so that pushed against that sense of fatalism and hopelessness. And endlessly people swing from fatalism and hopelessness to, oh, we've got it licked, and back again. And that's just the pendulum that will be with, you know, that will be with us for forever. But I think you aren't going to get activity through disaster unless, God save us, the disaster gets really huge. If any of you have read what was undoubtedly the most powerful and maybe most influential climate book that came out last year, Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, The Ministry for the Future, that opens with a truly catastrophic climate event, which starts to drive new forms of political, economic, and social change. I would love it if we could get to some of those new forms without an event that dreadful.
Can I jump in there? Because I think in terms of the extreme weather events, it depends. I mean, that's sort of the thing that everybody has always said, you know, what kind of an extreme weather event will it take for people to wake up to the reality of climate change? And the sad truth is that it depends on where the extreme weather event happens and what the timing is. So things have different levels of power according to where, who, and when. And an example, I think of a really good example of that is the sorts of events that we've seen this year. So the floods in Germany, the fires in America and Canada, and also the fires in Australia, for instance, last year. These are starting to hit home in very unexpected ways. In places where it's always been assumed that these are countries that have the power and the money, and also are the power and the money to deal with it, but also are kind of shielded from it, right? The worst impacts of climate change undeniably happen in the poorer countries that have the least ability to deal with them. And the timing of those kinds of events is also insignificant because they've all happened in the run up to COP26. And there is, you know, we can talk about the importance or the relative importance or not of COP26, but the fact is that there's a lot of build up at the minute. And so these kinds of events do sort of put some degree of pressure. I don't think I agree with Ollie completely that they don't put a vast amount of pressure. And unfortunately, they're very, very quickly forgotten. But to me, there's a stark difference between, say, the events that we've seen this year and I can't remember which COP it was when there was Hurricane Haiyan that hit the Philippines just before the COP kicked off. And, you know, the Philippine negotiator stood up and practically cried on the stage. It was a real emotional moment. And yet, unfortunately, it's the Philippines and it doesn't have as much clout. So I think there's something kind of interesting about extreme weather events and the location that's happening right now. And the other thing in terms of what will it take, the answer has to be it's going to take a lot of different things. There's no single factor that is going to bring this problem to a head. And that's because climate change is incredibly complex, involves absolutely everyone, involves every part of the economy, involves every country, every government. And so there's no single thing that's going to sort of hit this one nail on the head, right? It's a big, big problem.
You've also got to remember that humans knowing things doesn't mean that humans as a group can act as a group. There are no political mechanisms to make that happen. That was possibly the great lesson of the Copenhagen COP, the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009. There is no world government. There is no way of making a world government by which humans who know something can make other humans act on it. We just don't live in that sort of world. And so it is quite possible, even for people of goodwill but with different agendas, to end up not taking the drastic action that climate really seems to demand but hasn't as yet got.
So you've anticipated several readers' questions, Oliver. They are indeed, nevertheless, optimistically asking, how could we create that kind of global governance? I mean, is that in itself just impossible? Is it naive to expect that something like COP could at least come in the direction of moving beyond just, say, national interest or whatever? Or is it kind of impossible to find a better, maybe not perfect, but a better, I'll take John's question. How do we create an effective and accountable global governance before it is too late? National sovereignty is evidently the wrong tool for these kind of global challenges. I mean, is the question there how, or is that something that you think is just impossible?
I don't think that we're going to sort of like overthrow the Westphalian model of the state, other than through really quite extreme forms of slow or fast violence. And I don't want to live through or bequeath to anyone such a transition. I think it will be really quite rough. I do think, I mean, so the answer to the question is, by showing that imperfect versions of it can achieve things, I think you might be able to get people to buy into improving the version that you have. And that's somewhat the logic of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement says, we want these temperature targets well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, ideally as close as possible to 1.5 degrees above. These are the targets we want. And it then says, here are the things that we individually as nations are doing to those ends. What are called the nationally determined contributions. And there's a massive gap between how much carbon the various nations are planning to emit under their nationally determined contributions and how much they should be emitting with the temperature target. So everyone knows that that's a gap. The idea of Paris is that as things go on and as people learn from each other that it is possible to decarbonize faster and more deeply than people have previously imagined, and that's very much a lesson that you can take from renewable energy between 2010 and 2020. No one, except possibly Greenpeace, ever predicted how fast the solar energy boom was going to boom. So if you can get something like that and have people see that it's working, if you can get something like that in the political sphere where people realize that this is, though still monumental, not fully impossible, and particularly that being on the front end of it is going to be better for them than being on the back end of it, then the idea is you can have a sort of like self-catalyzing virtuous race. That's a very optimistic way to read history. You look back at the 19th and 20th century and you do not immediately say to yourself, oh, look at all these self-catalyzing virtuous races that made the planet better. However, I think it may actually be the best game in town, because it's a big planet and it's a small planet, but we are very constrained by the histories that we all live in, and those histories give us largely capitalist economies and nation states, and it's very hard to see how you get rid of either of those in a hurry. And it's also quite hard to see for sure that anything else you might come up with would be better, because there are definitely worse ways to run the world.
Well, within
Sasha, I think in John's
Katrina.
question there was something about how do you hold these governments to account, and just in a very practical sense, I wanted to mention that the Paris Agreement is actually an incredibly complex set of mechanisms. It's not just the 1.5 to 2. There's a whole host of stuff that's wrapped into it as well. And one of the things is, in fact, transparency and accountability. And, there's a global stock take, for instance, that has to happen every 5 years, and governments need to come back and say what they're doing. So there are the UN does actually, well, let's just say the people who wrote the Paris Agreement were wholly aware of its failures and did as much as they could to build in mechanisms to sort of hedge those failures and those weaknesses. And I think most people don't realize that it's actually a massive instrument.
So within sort of the world we live in, Katrine, you're going to spend quite a bit of time in Scotland in November, COP26. Can you just talk us through why is this year's COP particularly important? And its tagline is "Uniting the world to tackle climate change." You know, it sounds how fanciful is that? How achievable is that ambition? And just, you know, if you could just be the boss of COP, you know, what do what do countries, although actually also companies, actually need to commit to achieve any of the aims that you would set them?
So several parts to that question. First of all, on the tagline, every single one of these COPs has a tagline, and I pay it zero attention except when it comes to possibly filing in order to make fun of the tagline. In Madrid, which is the last COP that we had 2 years ago, the tagline had something to do with time and delivering on time, and in fact, it was the latest COP that had ever taken place. So the taglines you can forget about. Why is COP26? Why is this particular COP particularly important? So COVID has kind of screwed up the timings, pushed things back by a year. Hopefully people will know that this COP, this meeting, and they are annual, was meant to in fact take place in December last year, or at the end of last year, sorry, and was pushed to this year as a result of COVID. Last year, it would have been 5 years since the Paris Agreement was made in 2015. And built into the Paris process is, so just to backtrack a bit, Ollie mentioned the fact that the Paris Agreement has these sort of specific goals, the 1.5 to 2 degrees target. And I mentioned that there are failings within the Paris Agreement. When the Paris Agreement was made, they had, on the one hand, these targets, these lofty sort of long-term goals, and they were temperature goals. And on the other hand, every country was made to come to the table and say, this is how much we can do at home in terms of cutting our emissions. And when you totted up everything, so these NDCs that Ollie mentioned, when you totted up all of the NDCs in terms of emissions and then did some complicated maths to translate that into a projected temperature rise by the end of the century, you arrived at something along the lines of 3 to 3.5 degrees of global warming. So a lot more than the 1.5 to 2. The Paris architects were fully aware of that sort of dichotomy, of that contradiction. And so built into the Paris Agreement is what is parochially known as the ratchet mechanism. And the idea was, okay, governments can't offer enough today, or are possibly for some of them unwilling to offer enough today to reach the 1.5 to 2 degrees target. But as more effective technologies become available, as the existing technologies become cheaper, as the pressure increases and the political buy-in increases, as companies in the private sector start to become more involved, and in the end, in fact, as people, citizens, voters, take this on as a cause, their governments will be able to offer more. And so every 5 years, parties to the Paris Agreement are required to come forward and present a new NDC. So we said X before, and now we're saying Y, and hopefully Y is actually more than X. And so you start to get closer, you ratchet your way step by step towards this sort of 1.5 to 2 degree range. And that's every 5 years. COP26 is 5 years since COP21, which was the Paris Agreement. And so that's why this particular one has taken such importance, is because it is the first sort of reckoning. And it's important to note that it's not the last reckoning, right? So everybody's making a big deal out of COP26. Everybody is sort of, the media is talking about it constantly. The politicians are talking about it constantly. It's all we hear about these days, or it's certainly all I hear about. But it is not the be all and end all. There will be a COP27, and importantly, there will also be a COP31. There will be another 5 years.
Yeah, if I could just come in on that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a tension built into the whole thing of COP26 unifying the world against climate change. You would have thought that at some point in COPs 1 through 25, this idea of unifying the world would have come up before. The fact that you're now in 26 and you're still talking about it does say something that one might be cynical about. There's another sense, which I think Kat touched on, which was actually sort of like basically made official in the Paris Agreement, which is in general, the diplomatic world has its own rhythms, and big COPs have tended to come, roughly speaking, in sort of like 5-year cycles. So the original signing of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was in 1992, and then in 1997 we had the Kyoto Agreement, and then things went all a bit pear-shaped during the Bush administration, and then in 2009 we had Copenhagen, and then in 2015 we had Paris, and now here we are in Glasgow. So there is this sense that, you know, after a big COP, everything winds down and everyone's a bit exhausted. It's probably not a coincidence that the year after Copenhagen we all went to Cancun and really didn't achieve very much. But then as you wind down, then you start winding forward again, and it's just not something that can be done. You can't ratchet it up year on year. Seems to be a natural cycle. The problem with this is that there are also geophysical cycles, and they don't hang around. And so, you know, 2040, which is a time at which on many current pledges, estimates, hopes, pious hopes, the Western world will be well down towards net zero. That's only 4 big COPs away, right? And that's so, 2040 is closer than the Kyoto Protocol to us by quite a long way.
We're getting lots and lots of questions about what different what companies, what individuals, what governments can do. So I'm gonna ask one last question and then move into that direction of what to do, because I agree with the readers. You know, the urgency is clear. On maybe we can bring up the first chart actually. China and America are the world's biggest polluters by a long way, and you can see different changes. Katrine, maybe talk me through what we're looking at here, and as you do, maybe you can take this question of Hans into account, who wonders, it's all good and well having a multilateral forum, but really we're talking about a few big countries, aren't we? And how likely are these countries like China, to accept, the importance of really quite radical changes? Can they be forced or persuaded, or how should we think about? Obviously, it's not just China as you look at this chart, but how should we think about the sort of need to deal with a few massive emitters rather than getting 200 countries into a room to try to get to an agreement?
So I mean, in terms of what we're looking at, it sort of says it up there. This is carbon dioxide emissions by country, and I see a bunch of regions have been, regions have been grouped as well in gigatons. Gigatons are billions of tons. And I mean, what you can clearly see is, as you said, there are a few major emitters. I'd say what you're seeing here is first the fast and extremely rapid rise in emissions since far over in the left, we've got 1850, which is sort of, I guess, code for pre-industrial times. So this insane rise, right? That just tells you the scale of the problem. Another thing that I think is notable here is you can see quite clearly that emissions are still rising. There have been a couple times when they've dropped. The most recent thing that you can see there is the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. If this extended out to post-COVID, you would see another drop in 2020. And then I'm afraid a rise again because we're going up again. It's interesting to see that flattening off in 2019, and it's true that in fact there were signs of a potential plateau just as we were going into COVID. I'd suggest we move from this slide to another one, which I think is queued up, where you see what needs to happen in order to achieve Paris. This is where we need to go, right? Emissions are rising. They've been rising. They keep rising year on year. There's a small chance we're at a plateau, but who knows? Actually, what needs to happen is they need to fall off a cliff. What this also shows is that China's emissions need to fall off a cliff more than anybody else's. And in fact, if you look at the left-hand panel here, you can see that, the EU emissions are actually dropping. US emissions, drop, rise, but sort of ish drop. But China and, generally speaking, and completely unsurprisingly, developing countries are generally on the rise. And you can't deny them that, right? They need to have their chance to achieve the wealth and health that developed nations already have. And yet there is this global requirement, if we are going to meet the climate targets, that these emissions absolutely fall off a cliff. Now, what do you do to get the major emitters on board? And should we just have the big fish, as it were, in a room and let them duke it out, and everybody else can sort of sit on the side and wait for the outcome? Personally, I think absolutely not. I think you'll find that the developing countries would say absolutely not. They need to be in the room. And the reason is that whatever decisions are made by the big emitters ultimately affect them, if not in any other way, as a result of, simply as we were saying earlier, the fact that they suffer the impacts of climate change far more than anybody else. That said, the COP process does not exist in a vacuum. We have multilaterals, we have bilaterals. We just had the G20, the G7, you've got G2s. It's all part of a big mechanism. And you certainly, I'd say the sort of big players, the European Union, the United States, and China, have in recent years been putting a fair bit of effort into sort of pulling themselves to a position where they're all pulling in the same direction, with, blips under the Trump administration, which we'd all quite like to forget. And so let's move on from that. But these big emitters are talking to each other and are putting pressure upon each other. Unfortunately, there's forever this problematic timescale of none of this happens anywhere near as fast as it's required by the climate.
If we just look at how the world is doing in terms of reaching the target sets in Paris and the Paris Agreement, are there any just looking for some good news? Are there any countries that are leading the way, that are sort of showing how it can be done, or doing well? We talked a bit about where the challenge lies. So where's the good news? Who's doing well?
The Gambia.
The Gambia, Oliver.
Well,
no, actually, yes.
Actually, although the UK is doing not too badly. The UK has managed to, and the UK's emitting less than it did in the 20th century, and I think that's not bad. And Sweden's doing reasonably well, but no one is doing brilliantly. And no one is showing the sort of like sharp reductions in, and what you want to see is sharp reductions in carbon dioxide emissions coupled to vibrant economic growth. That's what you want, because if you can't get those two things together, it's going to be really, really hard to get either one of them separately in the long term.
So I mentioned the Gambia because there's an outfit called Climate Action Tracker, which basically does the hard work of reviewing every last little bit of every country's political pledges, NDCs, etc. And their most recent update, so they sort of rate countries according to how sufficient or not their pledges are to meeting the 1.5 degree Paris target. And their latest update has one country, the Gambia, whose pledges are 1.5 degrees Paris Agreement compatible, and everybody else is somewhere between almost sufficient, and the notable one in that list is the UK, because it's the only rich country in that list, and insufficient, highly insufficient, and critically insufficient. The UK is doing well in terms of its promises, notably. So the stuff that it's put on the table it's consistent with 1.5. In terms of promises. The problem is that the policies aren't following. So, we say this all the time, it's very easy to promise something. It's much harder to actually follow through and make that happen. And importantly, if you're a government, put into place the policies that will outlive your own government and persist into decades ahead and actually achieve the goals that are either in 2030 or 2040 or 2050. So the UK is doing quite well in terms of its promises. Definitely needs to start walking the walk as well as talking the talk. But there are other
Okay.
interesting things about the UK. It's the Climate Change Act in the UK is an impressive instrument which sort of goes into its good performance.
I'm going to become a little bit stricter with the two of you because you have far too many interesting things to say. So I need shorter answers, or otherwise we're never going to be able to deal with all our lovely subscribers. Lots of questions about what else can be done and by whom, and what about the private sector and individuals. So maybe before I mention some of those, Ollie, can you just help frame this a little bit? When it comes to who needs to do what, how do you think about responsibility for action between governments, businesses, and individuals, or perhaps you think of other players as well? Just sort of the meta vision there. Who's responsible for what, as far as you're concerned?
I'm primarily a governments guy. Governments are, especially democratic governments, are governments we elect to do things that need to be done in the public sphere. You can have, and indeed at the economists we do have, vibrant debates about what the role of a company should be, but it's not clear to me that there's anything like a settled opinion that the role of the company is to make the world better regardless. Whereas in terms of securing the long-term future of its citizens and its future citizens, that's something that countries are meant to do. I think there's we could talk more about it. You wanted it short, so I'm going to stay with that. Countries, governments.
Governments. Well, okay, so let's start with governments. Peter actually wonders, I suspect Peter is less of a governments guy. Can governments just stop protecting fossil fuels, remove import restrictions on solar panels, and make land available? In other words, can they just get out of the way and let the private sector and the markets get the job done? What would your response to Peter be?
Well, making land available sounds kind of like a fairly active thing, like a sort of eminent domain. I mean, making land available for a train track between London and Birmingham and Manchester has been proving quite difficult. And it's not just a question that governments have done a huge amount to make solar power, especially the German government, to make solar power cheaper. It would not have become cheaper without government subsidies in really quite eye-watering amounts if you're German. The idea that governments can just get out of the way, yes, a lot of good people of goodwill will buy themselves solar panels, and they may even, if they were very goodwill, take a capital hit on doing so. But they're absolutely not. But that's not going to be everybody. This is the problem. If you rely on the people of goodwill, you're effectively putting a tax on people of goodwill, and everyone else says, well, the people of goodwill are doing all that, and then it doesn't get done. So if you want to get people, and the other side of that is that government seems very coercive. The great thing about politics is it's a way to get people from different points of view and with different agendas to agree on some things that they want to get done. And that, I think, has to be the model for climate change, action against climate change in democratic countries.
Okay, comprehensive answer. Anonymous has asked, what can private companies do? What is the role of the private industry?
Can I just say, I love your music and poetry. It's great.
What can private companies do? I mean, point taken on the lens through which you see this, but I just wonder what is, as does Anonymous, what is their role, particularly companies that have high carbon footprints?
To see the writing on the wall.
Perhaps you want to take that one. Okay, go on.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I fall into Ollie's camp here, so I'm more of a government person as well. But look, the signal is very clear, right? The future is not in fossil fuels, and you have to be completely blindsided these days to think that the future is in fossil fuels. And to be honest, even the CEOs of major fossil fuel companies know this. And so really balancing the sort of the requirements and the needs of your shareholders to also see the long-term writing on the wall. This is going to be a transition towards a low carbon economy. And if you take say corporate social responsibility seriously, then don't make it a little tagline on the side, and actually mainstream that into the strategy of the company. the writing is absolutely on the wall.
Another answer, because I don't want Peter to think that we're a hotbed of statists. And obviously, another thing governments can do is put prices on carbon so that companies can actually make money out of emitting less carbon, and can sell products that have added value because they emit less carbon. And the other important thing companies can do is come up with ideas that governments will never come up with, for things that people might want to consume that will be better for the planet than the things that they are currently consuming, and ideally will be bordering on the harmless. And so, one of the great examples of this is Tesla, and I can go toe to toe with many people on criticisms of Elon Musk, but the basic insight that by making a car in a niche market that was better than the other cars in that market and was also electric would allow him to grow both a small amount of market share, but a lot of technological know-how and manufacturing understanding, and a spectacular stock market capitalization, and thus push him into more and more cheaper cars, or moderately cheaper cars, and really change the way that much of the rest of the industry thought about electric cars, because having a company that put them at the center of a high value business was very different from sort of like having them as the weird futuristic thing that you do on the fringe. And so a company that can come in and disrupt an old market with something that's genuinely climate positive, that's what we really look to the private sector for.
Another example that doesn't get mentioned much is Microsoft, right? So Microsoft is one of these companies that has set a net zero target for itself, etc. But what's completely different in Microsoft's net zero target is that they are proposing to not just be net zero between, say, today and I can't remember exactly the date, but some decades down the line, but actually net zero over its entire history. So it is somehow proposing to offset, counterbalance, suck out the emissions that it has already put into the atmosphere through its future actions.
Katrina, I've got to ask, what do you make in general of the idea of carbon offsets? Are they the solution, or are they slightly misleading?
I mean, they're a little bit of both, right? So you can't offset forever. There's absolutely no question. Ultimately, what needs to happen is that emissions need to come down. So mitigation is it's not unavoidable, but bar being in a world that none of us, I think, want to live in, mitigation is unavoidable. But on the way to achieving these sort of net zero, I think there has to be some offsets. And the classic example for this is there are sectors and industries today where we don't really have any easily available technologies, or certainly not at scale, to eliminate emissions. So aviation is a classic example, shipping is another example, steel and cement. There's a lot of work that's going into trying to eliminate, or at least minimize those emissions, but we're not there yet. And yet we need to be there yesterday, right? So in the meantime, I think there's a role for offsets. But recently I visited a direct air capture plant in Iceland, where they are now going to be sucking 4,000 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere every year for the next 12 years. By the way, that's nothing, but it's this sort of kind of pioneering company that hopefully is going to be the first part of a new industry. If people look at that and say, well, that's fine, I can buy those emissions as offsets and I can carry on doing what I'm doing now, then that's obviously the wrong way to think about it. And I should mention, by the way, that the company that is operating that plant is actually part of The Economist's climate strategy, just for full disclosure.
Full disclosure, quite right. Okay, let's move on to Karen. Karen is rightly bringing in the individual. We've got governments, we've got companies, but what about just us? I mean, just before this call, actually, I had a fight with my husband over how important it was to switch the lights off. I think in the grand scheme of things, it's not that important. He thinks it's very important because it's something I can control. I'd like the two of you to set that right. But linked to that, Karen basically asked, personal responsibility, what can I personally do to mitigate climate change? And I guess there's an underlying question there of to what extent can individuals really make a difference. I'd like both of your answers, but I'd like to be short and sharp. I'll start with Ollie and then go to Kat.
Karen, it's basically a question of moral philosophy. Are you a virtue moralist, or are you a consequentialist moralist? If you think that the moral value of your actions is their consequence, then there's very little consequence in you as an individual changing your habits, just as there's very little consequence in you as an individual voting. It's something that people should do, voting, and I think many people would think it's something that people should do to reduce your emissions. But it's not in itself an answer, because for reasons I gave earlier, if only people who are willing to make the sacrifice, you're not going to get the level of sacrifice that is wanted. If you're a virtue moralist and virtue ethicist, and you think that your actions matter because what they say about and what the person that they make you, then you have a stronger case for environmental action. But it's not going to have, because for the reason I just gave, it's not going to make the world better, but it will arguably, if that's your moral philosophy, make you feel better.
Katrine?
Ollie and I have been talking about this quite a lot recently. I broadly agree with what you just said. So, you know, your or our individual emissions each year are a tiny, tiny fraction of the global emissions. And obviously you have leverage over a small fraction of global emissions as well. And that's the important thing. So the real net consequences are very small. However, I don't think that that's necessarily a useful thing to focus on, because I think people do usefully want to focus on this sort of sense of hopelessness. So when people talk about what can I personally do, it's generally in response to a sense of hopelessness and a sense of wanting to feel like they are part of the solution. And personally, I think that's important. The other thing is that I have a bit of a gripe with the question of what can I personally do, which is generally answered in terms of the emissions in your home, your cars, your flights, your diet. Should I eat meat? Should I not eat meat, etc. Basically everything that happens within the four walls of your house. And I think that most of us forget that we have more leverage than just what happens within the four walls of our house. And in particular, I suspect that many of the people on this call have a lot more leverage than just what happens within the four walls of their house. So no doubt there's being the economists, there will be CEOs on this call, there will be people who can influence quite a lot more than just their family. And so that there, if you are a CEO, if you are a farmer and you are part of a wider agricultural system. If you work in the oil sector, if you have a solar power plant somewhere, ask yourself what you can do professionally, and then I think your personal influence becomes much greater.
That's a good call to action. I'm sure there are plenty of people taking notes right now. Okay, we're going to race through a few more. Dan wants to know whether planting trees will help. Why are we not talking about the impact that live plants can have in addressing climate change? And his question goes on. But, you know, it's a fair one. You know, go on, Ol.
I'll take that. As someone who in another life wrote a book about photosynthesis, yes. Planting trees helps a lot, but you need to plant huge numbers of trees. And there's a very simple reason for this. When I say huge numbers, I mean more trees than we have land to put them on. It's a very simple reason for this. The coal that we're burning is old forests. And we are burning through hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years of old forests in a few years of real time. So it's not surprising that the amount we're putting out is far beyond the capacity of forests to pick up in any reasonable assessment of how much land you could devote to forestry. That's not to say that you shouldn't let forests regrow. There are a lot of ways that forests can help, but they certainly can't do the whole bit.
And just to add to that, if you're planting trees, make sure you're not also cutting them down. And as well as planting trees, consider just conserving trees. So it's not just about new trees, it's also about conserving the forest stock that already exists.
Okay, so trees are sort of one of the, you know, well, I don't want to say one of the oldest, but probably one of the oldest, you can't call them a technology, but solutions out there. What about the other extreme? I mean, lots of questions are basically about can tech fix this? I mean, Albert asks, I'm paraphrasing, but is it reasonable to bet on emerging technologies to reduce emissions, basically, so we don't have to change our behaviour too much. I'm sure you'll tell Albert that's not the best bet. But where does tech come into all of this, and how hopeful are you both about maybe pick one, any particular emerging technologies to help us reduce emissions? Albert, do you want to go first?
I'll pick an emerged technology. Solar has outperformed everyone's expectations for solar. I think it may well continue to do so for quite some time. It has, and as people used to think you just couldn't put that much solar on a network. Turns out that you can put on a lot more than they thought. By making the network smarter, you can get more out of solar. So yeah, I'd say for the time being, and in general, it's really exciting. It's really important to get some new technologies, and it's really exciting to think about them. But if it ever becomes a reason for not deploying the technologies that are already up to the job, then you have to ask yourself whether your enthusiasm may in fact be hiding some slightly baser motive. Not
actually,
you yourself,
really quickly,
Albert.
Ollie. Don't worry. Clark, actually, whilst we're on solar, Clark wonders how can the material we need for solar energy generation be built without the basic elements that come from the fossil energy sector? In other words, is there a way of making solar even better?
Well, the more you have solar in your grid, the less fossil fuel energy you need to build new solar panels. So there, to some extent, that's a sort of like that is a virtuous circle. As your grid gets cleaner, all the things you do with it get cleaner, and this is sort of like that's the engine behind the, as it were, the easier half of the utterly massive problem of decarbonising the economy, is that as electricity gets greener and you learn to do more and more things with electricity, things become simultaneously greener and cheaper. Because solar and wind are outcompeting fossil fuels in many markets already. For them to really triumph, they're going to have to be really cheap. And we are well on the way to that happening. Now, that's not to ignore the problems with intermittency and storage. But if you have a process, an industrial process that can make do, that doesn't need constant amounts of electricity, that can make do with a lot sometimes and less at other times, industrial cooling is a good example, things are going to get really good for you, especially if you're willing to give control over your thermostat to your electricity supplier. So there's going to be a lot of cheap energy if you know where to look for it and use it. And that's going to be very helpful to the economy.
Shall I answer the tech question? I think Ollie probably left me the obvious one that he knew I was going to go for, which is ultimately we can't achieve the Paris targets unless we start removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the climate models are really unequivocal about that. The 1.5 degree target, pretty much no matter what happens, we are very likely to be hitting, or we are likely to be hitting at some point in the next few decades. So if we're going to come back down to it, we're going to need what's known as negative emissions. So that industry doesn't exist at scale. It can look like trees. Or which would be low tech, or it can look like artificial trees, which would be high tech. And so, yes, we need some technologies, and that is completely unavoidable. However, I think it's really important. I'm personally not a techno-optimist. I don't think that it's all about the technologies. I think some of the really important things that need to happen are in fact really low tech and really boring, and there are things like better insulation, better energy efficiency, etc. Using less energy generally is going to go a long way to minimizing emissions, certainly as long as we are burning fossil fuels. And then another example of the boring stuff is methane. CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas that we emit. Methane packs a huge punch in terms of warming the climate. It also, for reasons which I won't go into now because we don't have time, offers the opportunity to slow the rate of warming over sort of a decade's timescale as opposed to centuries, basically. And a lot of the methane that we put out, or that human societies put out today, come quite simply from leaks in the fossil fuel infrastructure, leaks in gas pipes, for instance. All you have to do is plug them. Identify them, plug them. It's very low tech, it's really dull, but it's extremely efficient. And I think the estimate is that if a quarter of all methane emissions were cut by 2050, you could cut 0.2 degrees off of the sort of projected warming, which is quite a lot when you're talking about trying to reach 1.5 to 2 degrees.
A few very last questions. David is asking about misinformation. And we're currently experiencing undesirable outcomes of misinformation in the context of the pandemic. How are we going to tackle the communication challenges of climate change, convince the public and push politicians towards climate action? Is there, I mean, other than watch webinars with The Economist, is there a more profound, this might go back to our opening question actually, but way of reaching the general public? Or do you actually feel we're kind of there, Oliver? Have we actually now reached a point where there is actually quite a lot of momentum and quite a lot of agreement amongst the general public that this stuff matters?
I think we get a little bit blindsided by too frequently taking our lead from America on this, where the conversation is particularly polarized and difficult. In fact, and we also have to worry about the fact, do we have to worry about it? I think maybe we have to worry a bit about the fact that some people have an exaggerated view of how prompt and how personal the threats due to climate change are. The important thing about climate change is not that it's going to have a huge death toll in developed countries within the next 30 years, and it's really that it's going to hurt, harm, kill a lot of people, mostly in poor countries. And the other thing to remember is it's not going to destroy the planet, it's just going to hurt humans. And you have to think primarily, although it comes out of environmental concern, the reason for climate action is deeply humanitarian, that you want to make sure that fewer people get hurt than would otherwise happen.
So there's work to do in the PR there, right? Because that's not necessarily how, a lot of people talk about saving the planet, the Earth.
And I make this point to people in the Green, and the message "Save the Planet" is more popular than the message "Let's make the Sahel a little bit richer and healthier" and things like that. And I don't know what to do about that. I mean, people really groove on the images of, and sometimes people actually get a certain sort of like charge out of images of cascading edges of glaciers going into the sea. And it goes back to something I was talking about earlier. It goes back to this sort of like mix of immense potency and impotence. This idea that, look, I'm part of this huge thing, which is kind of sublime in a very historical based idea of what the sublime is. And then I don't really do very much. I worry about that. I think that, you have to see this as the context for all the other action that you might want to take to make the world a better place.
Katrina?
I was just going to say that that's an excellent place to end. I mean, that is an excellent. It's very well put. I'd like to think that at The Economist we do that well, and I think there's a lot of other media out there, including New Scientist, who do it well as well. The whole disinformation issue, I feel, and I could be wrong, but it's kind of a thing in terms of it having a real impact and being a real threat. To me, it feels like it's a thing of the past. We don't have the problem anymore that we used to have with climate skeptics genuinely pushing a sort of climate change isn't happening agenda. And thank God, because the column inches that we spent sort of dispelling those myths were frankly quite painful. It's now about taking a hard, honest look at what can be done, the solutions, and how quickly they can be put into action. So yeah, I don't know, that's nowhere near as sort of eloquent a conclusion as Ollie just offered us, but it's in terms of strictly answering this sort of disinformation issue, there are some exceptions to this, but I feel like we've moved beyond that.
Well, I mean, one thing I thought of, and I'm just going to plug it very quickly, is your 3 degree cover, which was just immensely informative. You've written about what a 3 degree world would look like and just what we now know about what it would look like. Can you, in 40 seconds,
like that.
Tell us exactly, beyond this picture of the penguins, what does a 3 degree future look like?
Yeah, I mean, we get asked that, and I get asked that a lot. And it's quite a difficult one to answer because despite the thousands of words that went into that piece, the a 3-degree world is actually really, really difficult to imagine because it is so radically different to the world that we exist today, and radically different to the world that anybody who is alive today has any knowledge and understanding of. But to give a few sort of stark examples, in terms of natural systems, it's transformative. So the thing that keeps coming up is in science studies, for instance, is the fact that corals cease to exist beyond, I think, 2.5 roughly degrees of warming. The Antarctic ice sheet starts to break down, which commits the world in the long term to something on the order of 1.5 or more meters of sea level rise. And, you know, think of all of the cities that are at sea level today that basically that would wipe out. The Amazon is unlikely to be able to survive 3 degrees of warming. So this is really on the sort of grand ecological scale, completely transformative. And of course, each one of those is a natural system. And as Ollie just pointed out, we are not, you know, talking about saving the planet because these systems disappear and change and transform themselves. And Earth as a system has been through far worse. But think of the humans that depend on that. Think of the humans, think of what coral reefs supply in terms of fisheries, in terms of coastal protection, in terms of tourism. Think of what the Amazon supplies. Think of, again, you know, sea level, that amount of sea level rise is really difficult to imagine in terms of human consequences. The Arctic and regions that, well, primarily the Arctic, completely transformed, and traditional cultures that rely heavily on the natural systems that exist today can no longer exist. So, you know, Ollie was talking about the biggest losers not being people in, you know, who live in LA, for instance, or New York or wherever. But there are, you know, these societies are fundamentally based on the natural systems and the ecosystems that survive, that surround them. And so you're condemning those societies. And that's an incredible choice to make as a species. And then the one of the things that I mentioned in that 3 degrees piece is perhaps the thing that really brings this home is that at 3 degrees, parts of the tropics become completely unlivable to humans. And this is just a physical limit. The temperatures that you reach repeatedly throughout the year are actually uninhabitable. And so, yes, you could have full-time air conditioning, etc. But any kind of profession that involves being outside, and again, we're talking, you know, farmers, construction industry, etc., becomes lethal. And that's quite remarkable, really. We're talking about a world that is so completely different to the one that we live in today that I do think that we need to do our most to avoid that.
There's an understatement in there, absolutely, and that is it. Honestly, please worth reading. We are now out of time. We're going to speak with both of you again during COP. So I'm going to ask you in a line, what is the thing? Because I'll ask you again in November how well we're doing on that front. What is the thing you most hope or dream about that might be achieved at COP, however wishful? What one specific thing you'd like to see? Oliver, why don't you go first and then I'll go to Katrine.
Okay, my specific kind of achievable would be genuine words in the statement about fossil fuels envisaging times after which they will no longer be exploited. So that's a very big ask. My super big ask is that the Saudi minister stands up and says that they're going to throw Saudi Aramco into reverse and use the oil fields to put carbon dioxide back in the ground. And here is the team of female managers and engineers that's going to make that happen for our great kingdom. So that's that's my dream for COP.
Reasonable wish list. What about you, Katrine? Try to top that.
I was going to be less ambitious, considerably less ambitious. I was going to say my dream would be some kind of statement about the end of fossil fuels, or specifically, and this is something that is being discussed, the end of coal. I actually personally think that is well, I mean, Ollie said it's a big ask. I agree. I think that is a big ask. If you sort of want to set the bar low, and hope for something that is eminently achievable, then I would say I would hope that those temperature projections that we were talking about, you add up all of the promises and you look at where they land. They're currently scarily close to 3. Say between 2.5 to 3. I would like to see that needle come down.
Okay, I've noted them both down, and we shall talk again in November, and I hope you, our audience, will join us again then. Oliver, Kat, thank you so much for joining. This was such a delight, and I look forward to seeing you again in November.
Thank you, Sasha.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to find out more about our upcoming subscriber events, please click the link. There you can also find information about our previous events, including one on whether the US is in decline 20 years after 9/11. Thanks again for watching, and see you soon.